If you've spent years studying Iron Age warfare, you already know most battles weren't decided by heroic charges or glorious last stands. They were decided before the enemy even realized a fight had begun. What I want to share with you today is one of those methods. An ambush doctrine so effective, so brutally unfair, that later armies deliberately stopped teaching it in its original form. Not because it didn't work, but because it worked too well, required too much discipline, and left too little room for control once unleashed. This isn't legend or romantic exaggeration. Variants of this technique appear in Iron Age Celtic raids, early Roman frontier warfare, Near Eastern hill combat, and even in later medieval outlaw bands who rediscovered it independently. What makes it remarkable is not the weapons involved, but the psychology, timing, and environmental manipulation behind it. Why silence, not speed, was the core weapon? Most people assume ambush equals sudden violence. In Iron Age doctrine, silence was the true killing tool. Warriors were trained to move slower than instinct demanded, matching breath to footfall and footfall to terrain. The goal was not to strike fast, but to arrive unnoticed at a distance so close that reaction time vanished entirely. Ancient sources describe fighters standing motionless for hours within spear range, allowing patrols to pass repeatedly until fatigue and complacency set in. The ambush only triggered when the enemy formation subtly broke, one man adjusting armour, another turning his head, someone stepping out of line. That moment of human error, not a signal horn or shouted command, was the activation point. Applied practically, this teaches modern survivalists a critical lesson. Patience multiplies force. Whether you're observing wildlife, tracking people, or, just trying to avoid detection, movement discipline matters more than athleticism. The Iron Age fighter understood that being unseen was already halfway to victory. How terrain was weaponized long before maps existed. This technique relied on terrain familiarity at an almost intimate level. Warriors memorized ground textures with their feet, not their eyes. Dry leaves, loose shale, frozen grass, wet clay. Each demanded a different gait. Ambush sites were chosen not for concealment alone, but for sound control. Forests with dense undergrowth were avoided if noise couldn't be managed. Instead, fighters preferred transitional zones. Forest edges, shallow ravines, reed-lined streams, narrow passes where wind masked minor sounds. The enemy believed these areas were safe because visibility was, decent. That false sense of security was intentional. So, to apply this today, whether you're into wilderness navigation or historical reenactment training, try walking the terrain barefoot or in thin footwear, just when it's safe, of course. Learn where sound travels and where it, just dies away. This is exactly how Iron Age fighters trained their young warriors, by removing visual dominance and forcing really a heightened sensory awareness. Why was the first strike never the loudest? Contrary to popular belief, the ambush didn't begin with a scream or a volley. No, it began with removal. Sentries simply vanished without a sound. Rear guards, they stopped responding. The goal here was confusion, but without any clear confirmation. By the time the enemy realized something was wrong, they already lacked clear direction, leadership, or honestly, any real cohesion. Historical accounts describe throat compression blade placement under the jaw and spear shafts used not to stab, but rather to pin and suffocate. The violence was efficient, restrained, and frankly, deeply unsettling. Once panic set in, the ambush escalated rapidly, but only after the command structure had completely collapsed. For historians, this really reframes ancient warfare as systems-based combat rather than just, brute force. For survivalists, it reinforces the principle of targeting systems, communication, movement, morale, before engaging openly. Why did armies later ban or suppress this knowledge? Well, as warfare professionalized, commanders realized this technique created uncontrollable outcomes. Units trained this way became independent hunters rather than obedient soldiers. They relied on intuition, local knowledge, and initiative, which made centralized command, honestly, quite difficult. Roman reforms gradually discouraged prolonged silent stalking in favor of formations, signals, and predictable drills. Medieval armies echoed this shift. Silent ambush didn't scale well, and it terrified both enemies and allies. Teaching it meant accepting that once unleashed, warriors might not stop when ordered. This explains why the knowledge survived mostly on the fringes: raiders, border fighters, rebels, and woodsmen. It was never lost, only deliberately marginalized. So, how does this knowledge apply outside of warfare? Well, this technique is not about violence, really. It's about awareness, restraint, and, environmental mastery. Hunters, for instance, use its principles to approach game unseen. Search and rescue teams actually rely on similar movement control when they're listening for survivors. Even historians, when conducting field research, can benefit from learning how ancient people interacted with landscapes physically, not just in the abstract. Try this. Practice moving through familiar terrain at half your normal speed. Stop frequently. Listen longer than feels comfortable. Pay attention to how animals react to you, often before you even see them. These exercises honestly reconnect you with the embodied knowledge Iron Age fighters simply took for granted. So, why does this technique still matter? Understanding this ambush doctrine, I think, strips away the fantasy of ancient warfare and replaces it with something more unsettling and, more human. It reminds us that history was shaped not just by weapons and numbers, but by patience, fear, discipline, and silence. If this kind of deep, practical history is what you come here for, do make sure you subscribe to Iron Age Instincts, share this with fellow researchers and survival-minded thinkers, and keep these techniques alive, not as tools of harm, but as windows into how our ancestors truly lived, moved, and survived.